Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today's guest is Patrick Macfarlane from the Libertarian Institute. He also hosts the show Vital Dissent, and we're here to talk about China, and I'm very pleased to have him here. How are you doing today, Patrick?
Doing well, thanks.
So, do you just want to start by telling people a little bit about yourself, maybe even your work as a lawyer, and, your show and work with the Libertarian Institute?
Yeah, so I started my show I started the website in 2016 when I was a second-year law student, and I started the podcast a year later in 2017. It was a really good outlet for me at the time, although, I maybe could have spent that time studying, but I spent it, getting into this world. So I primarily was like a Ron Paul libertarian, kind of like an anarcho-capitalist type. When I started my show, I focused a lot on libertarian theory and libertarian legal theory. And then around 2019 and 2020, I really got turned on to the world of foreign policy. And I think it was just kind of getting a little bored with talking about the same subjects over and over again, just with theory and things like that. And I find foreign policy to be more challenging because it's complex and there's not always a right answer per se. There's a lot of depth to the topics. It can be challenging. And once you feel like you get through all of the libertarian stuff, it seems like you really just kind of, I love Tom Woods, but there's only so much that you can dive into like those topics and the theory. And that has a really important place, and I'm not trying to diminish that at all. But for me, I just wanted to take my project into kind of a different direction. In terms of how I kind of got into it is that I've always been friends with Kyle Ancelone since the very beginning. We had a small group of podcasters, and Kyle was one of us. And amongst the group, it always seemed like if there's any one of us who's going really serious about this and who's really going places with it, it's Kyle. Kyle's been a machine. He's been doing this for years, and he's like a computer with this. I mean, he just can draw everything and bring it in and make it relatable. And he has been doing his news roundups like every single morning since 2015 or 2016. That's almost 10 years of doing this now, and it's just incredible. And a lot of times it's thankless work, and foreign policy is not very sexy in terms of all the people who are creating content in this sphere. Like the culture war is a lot more popular, or talking about current events, or doing jokes, or doing a funny podcast. And again, I'm not diminishing those, but they're a lot more accessible to people, because doing what you're doing in foreign policy is really like eating your vegetables. People, unless you're someone who just really likes vegetables, it's a lot of work to get through and do things like that. So I was really alarmed by Dave DeCamp, when I got to be friends with him and read his work early in 2019 and 2020. I really realized that the entire U.S. foreign policy is shifting towards confronting China and entering a new Cold War with China. And it was very alarming to me. And it was very alarming to me to see that no one was really talking about it or realizing it, at least not outside of those esoteric foreign policy cliques. Now, in terms of my personal career, I own my own law practice. I started over a year ago. It's been going really well lately, although there's a lot of work, and it's a topic I don't talk about a whole lot, just because I get my kicks during the workday and then I don't really want to think about it afterwards. But the law is kind of a profession that has a tendency to completely envelop your life. I primarily focus on family law and criminal defense. And so in that time, I cleared 44 cases last year, and then I have over 40 right now that I'm working on. And it's been professional, but one thing I could talk about a lot, or excuse me, it's been great, not professional. Of course, it's been professional, but one thing that really deserves more attention is how the state of the criminal justice system in not just Wisconsin, where I practice, but the entire United States of America just seems like something's got to give at some point. Like the whole bottom is going to fall out, that there are these long-standing, long-suffering crises that are just burning, and you just wonder at what point is it all going to fall apart. and both on the prosecutorial side, but also on the criminal defense side. And so there's a lot to unpack there. So I guess with any topic, if you want to steer it in any direction you want to go in.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty cool that you have your own law practice. Just out of interest, how old are you?
I'm 29. I'll be turning 30 in August. So when I graduated law school in 2018, I was like 24 or 25. So I was pretty young to be going into that field. So I was young for my class to begin with. So yeah, the law is like, it's a really love-hate kind of thing. Like one moment you could be winning something and flying really, really high, and the next moment it seems like everything's falling down around you, but it's the excitement of being, I guess,
Well, to be 29 and doing that is pretty impressive. And just to back up your comments, I would recommend Dave DeCamp's work too. I did an interview recently with him, but just his work on anti-war, and he recently, and maybe the last few months or a year, I'm not actually sure, he does like a roundup video every day of the top news stories. So I'd recommend people watching that just to get, keep up to date with the news, and if you want to go further. But obviously the topic today is China. So can you tell us what the previous US policy was towards China and what the 3 communiques are?
Yeah, so I recently just did a deep dive on this topic because it's an incredibly confusing topic, and it pairs really well with our conversation about the law in general and what it is, because a lot of people have this idea that the law is some objective thing, that there's a right answer to every question, and that if you just write the law down and you apply the law, there's no gray area or anything like that. And this U.S. Taiwan China policy is a perfect example of the idea that there is no objective rule of law, that everything really is kind of a subjective understanding, and we determine these questions by whatever argument kind of carries the day. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily the correct one or that there's even a correct answer. So the audience will probably understand as I start to explain it. But before 1979, the United States recognized the Republic of China, which is the Chinese government in exile, because when the Chinese Civil War occurred between the mainland, the communists that were rising to power, and the non-communist government, the Republic of China, led by Chiang Kai-shek, the Republic of China forces were defeated, and they were resigned to retreat to the island of Taiwan, which they summarily kind of took over. And so at that point in time, of course, the United States had just won World War II and was kind of emerging as the dominant global power, and then had moved into opposing communism and being in this global struggle against communism as part of the Cold War. And it was incredibly strategically important to take Taiwan, in this global effort. And so the United States identified and recognized the Republic of China as being the true government of China, even though they were in exile. And so in 1972, Henry Kissinger takes some secret trips to China to kind of gauge the possibility of befriending China in order to turn them against, well, you wouldn't really necessarily need to try really hard to turn them against the Soviets and Russia, because there was this, relationship between the countries that really kind of exploded almost into war during the mid-60s. And so Kissinger recognized this, wanted to go over there and pursue the possibility of befriending China to turn them against the Soviet Union even more so, and to create that wedge. And if you think about it, it's actually a cogent strategy, right? As opposed to our strategy right now, which doesn't seem like it's a good strategy or really any strategy at all, is to do all these actions that drive China and Russia together into their own multipolar kind of world order that stands in opposition to the Western rules-based, and I say that in quotes, rules-based world order. Rules for me, or rules for thee, but not for me. That's kind of the Western system. And so essentially you have Kissinger putting out feelers, and then Nixon making a trip and basically kind of reestablishing communications with China and diplomatic relations. And then in 1979, you have the Carter administration coming in. Excuse me. So I should go back to 1972. There's the issue of, from Nixon, the Nixon administration issuing the first joint communique, the Shanghai communique, as it's known as, and basically it reestablishes diplomatic relations, and it identifies Taiwan as being kind of the touchstone of this new relationship between the United States and China, because it was such a contentious issue. And so you have, I don't have the text in front of me right now, but essentially you have a statement in there by the United States saying that, well, we acknowledge that all Chinese everywhere believe that there is one China and that Taiwan is a part of that China. We don't challenge that position. And basically we're going to establish relations with China itself. And basically a recognition, well, an acknowledgement of the fact that all Chinese everywhere believe there is but one China is kind of an admission that the United States needed to make in order to reestablish these diplomatic relations and to, in a sense, appease China and let them know that we're not, enemies, basically. So then you have the Carter administration coming through and basically taking the huge step of diplomatically and legally de-recognizing the Republic of China government on Taiwan, and instead switching your recognition to the People's Republic of China, the communist government on the mainland. And with that, basically reaffirming the first communique, but then also saying, well, there's one legitimate government of China, which in 1972, we said included Taiwan. So now in 1979, you're saying, well, there is one China. We previously didn't challenge the notion that Taiwan was part of that one China. Now we're saying there's only one legitimate government over that one China, and that is the People's Republic of China. So, I mean, the rest of it, the Taiwan lobby became incredibly upset about that. There was kind of general worry and, condemnation from the Taiwanese government. And the Taiwan lobby in the United States kind of pushed through, because the Taiwan lobby generally, all Congress people are generally influenced by the Taiwan lobby. It's kind of like the Israel lobby. And so they passed the Taiwan Relations Act, which basically establishes a de facto embassy in Taiwan. It's an embassy in action, but officially it's not an embassy. And it kind of established this, solidified these informal relations, says that the United States should maintain the ability to respond to a violent Chinese action against Taiwan. And generally, I mean, that kind of assuaged fears from Taiwan just a little bit, but it created this thing that we now know as strategic ambiguity, which is what the U.S. official policy is that, well, and this is very important because people will say that strategic ambiguity, they'll confuse it with the one China policy. But strategic ambiguity, I think, is only the notion of, well, what is the United States going to do in the event of a Chinese invasion or some kind of violent solution to the Taiwan question, which everyone generally pledged in the communiques that the question is an internal issue to be solved by the Chinese themselves, but to be solved peacefully. So if it does go into violent conflict, well, what are we going to do? Is the U.S. going to intervene? We don't really say. We tell the Taiwanese, well, you better pipe down with that rhetoric, because we might not come to your aid if the Chinese invade. And meanwhile, we tell China, well, you better not invade because we might do something. And really, conversely, that strategy, although it's not one I would necessarily advocate, has effectively kept the peace across the strait since 1979, although there has been, there was one major crisis that occurred in 1997, 1995, 6 or 7. And then, of course, there's Nancy Pelosi's visit, which I would argue created the fourth Taiwan Strait crisis, that I believe is currently ongoing. I mean, if you count, the PRC aircraft towing the median line between China and Taiwan pretty much every single day, and then all these military exercises that resulted, and these live fire exercises, the simulated blockade of Taiwan, and rockets being shot over the island. So that was a whole lot of talking. So it's a huge, complicated topic, and in all reality, there's legitimate arguments on both sides that the U.S. policy doesn't recognize Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan. That's the official, like Rex Tillerson, the ex-Secretary of State, has said that. That's what the State Department says. But I think that if you actually read the documents and the logical implications behind it, there is a winning argument that those documents actually did recognize Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan. So.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. I mean, I haven't looked into the subject enough to just give an answer blanket that I'd, debate someone on. But if you read them, the general feel of the documents is clearly that the US is saying that there is only one government and that it's the mainland China one. And you obviously said about the word acknowledged, and I did actually watch your recent podcast about, is Taiwan part of China, which I would recommend to people. It was good. Or you can, just go and read the documents yourself. But they do follow up saying, so they say, yeah, the US acknowledges China's claim that Taiwan is part of China and there isn't two Chinas, there's just one China. And then they follow up with, we do not challenge this. And I'll put this in the show notes and put it up on the screen, but they say they do not challenge it. And then they quote the first communique in the following ones and don't say anything that differs from that. So you can obviously point to technicalities and specific words to kind of get out of it, which I don't know why you'd want to really get out of it anyway. But the general feel of it and the good faith of it, you think, would be that, and rather than, literally, splitting hairs. But am I correct in saying there was a third communique and it was about arms to Taiwan in 1982 with Reagan, which is then followed up by the 6 assurances to Taiwan? Can you talk about that as well, please?
Yeah, so the third joint communique generally considered the sale of weapons from the United States to Taiwan because as a part of this strategy of dual deterrence, which I talked about before, which goes hand in hand with strategic ambiguity, but the dual deterrence is, trying to back each side down, China with threats of involvement and Taiwan with threats of non-involvement. The sale of weapons became kind of the key issue for the next few decades, because I think it was the second joint communique, or maybe it was the third, that said basically, yeah, the United States will and can continue selling weapons to Taiwan as long as it is less than parity with our sales to China, so that we're not giving Taiwan a strategic advantage over China itself. And going forward, the Taiwanese government actually drafted 6 assurances that they sent to the person who was formerly the U.S. ambassador to Taiwan. And that ambassador accepted those assurances and affirmed them as written, I believe. I don't know if there was some kind of a back and forth bargain going on there, but essentially the 6 assurances were, just assurances made to Taiwan of U.S. support, in a sense, that the U.S. wouldn't pledges not to support basically China's agenda in terms of it. Now, those 6 assurances, there is an explicit statement there. There is an explicit statement that we don't recognize Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan, but I don't. 6, the United States would not formally recognize Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan. And now that one was made, but I wouldn't think that Taiwan would be a party to that, because the original joint communiques, the parties were the United States and China, but in the 6 assurances, China is not a party to that treaty. So, and Taiwan drafted it itself, and it was accepted by someone who was a former ambassador to Taiwan, but now isn't officially a legal ambassador because the United States doesn't even recognize Taiwan as being a sovereign nation at this point in time anymore. So I don't think that the 6 assurances, that the 6 of the 6, I don't think that it's controlling here or really changes what was promised and reaffirmed and then triply reaffirmed with the communiques.
Am I correct in saying that the 6 assurances were declassified cables between the State Department or something? I was having a read of them earlier, and I think I've got the 6 up now. I can quickly just read to
Sure.
people. So it says the United States would not set. Sorry. The United States has not agreed to set a date for ending arms sales to Taiwan. The United States has not agreed to consult with the PRC on arms sales to Taiwan, as in they're not going to consult with China when they're going to send arms sales to Taiwan. The United States will not play a mediation role between the Taiwanese government and China. The United States has not agreed to revise the Taiwan Relations Act. The United States has not altered its position regarding sovereignty over Taiwan, and the United States will not exert pressure on Taiwan to enter into negotiations with the PRC. And then there's also, I think, Congress. We can get to sort of the legal framework now. Obviously, we're talking about then, but I think Congress in 2015, 2016 sort of reaffirmed these 6 assurances. Have you had a look at that?
I haven't. Maybe you can enlighten me on that, because I haven't looked into that question specifically. And furthermore, I don't really know, and maybe this is bad on me, is that I don't really know who has the authority in the US government to make these treaty obligations.
Yeah, I'm not. Maybe we should leave this subject for another day if we don't want to speak wrongly on this. Obviously, the 3 communiques are pretty clear. You can read them on the US government's history sort of cables. There's lots of information there. This is maybe a bit more open, up in the air. So, we'll leave that for now. But it kind of leads me to my next sort of question anyway, because that was 2015 and 2016. And obviously 3 communiques for 1972, and then the normalization of relations in 1979 with Jimmy Carter instead of obviously Richard Nixon, and then 1982 with Reagan with the arms sales to Taiwan. But when did you see, did you see a change in US policy over the last 20 years, and what do you think is the driving factor in that?
Yeah, there certainly was a big change in policy, and with the 3rd joint communique, there's a lot of promises made to China that haven't been followed at all. And the spirit of that communique was basically, well, we are currently selling weapons. We will sell them at parity or less than parity with China, and we'll be seeking to end our policy of selling weapons to Taiwan, which is just crazy, because if you follow current U.S. actions towards Taiwan, weapons sales have exploded. And not only that, but we've taken the steps of basically granting them weapons instead of just selling them. So doing this material assistance, not only that, but also training Taiwanese Marines by deploying U.S. forces. And I should qualify that by saying, they're small advisory forces, but they are U.S. forces nonetheless. And part of the 1st joint communique, I believe it was the first one, really contemplated the United States removing, and maybe it was the second one, but the U.S. removing their forces and emplacements and bases from the island of Taiwan, Formosa. Formosa is kind of the formal name for the island itself, to remove its forces from the island, and in kind of a non-confrontational way. And I think, the biggest reason for weapons sales to Taiwan is this idea that the hawks that like neoconservatives have, is that we can prevent a war by deterrence, by selling these weapons and making it so difficult and painful to China to invade or even contemplate an invasion that they just won't take that step. And closer ties between the U.S. and Taiwan is part of that too, this strategic ambiguity. But the weapons sales has been kind of a major feature of it. And I think it's a mistaken belief. Of course, we saw weapons sales to Ukraine and kind of a mirror involvement in that situation, although they're not the same situations. But we see how arms sales and closer ties with NATO, talks like that, the Stinger missiles going to Ukraine, a step that Trump took even beyond what Obama was willing to do, the involvement in internal Ukrainian government affairs, like the two coups in 2004 and then in 2014. And that didn't deter Vladimir Putin. In fact, it was viewed as aggression, or at least a provocation. And so we have some of the same people behind our Ukraine policy, pushing and redoubling that policy and trying to apply it to Taiwan. The line being, oh, well, obviously we did not deter enough in Ukraine. We didn't send enough weapons. We didn't get them as involved as we should have. Well, we learned our lesson and we're going to redouble those efforts with Taiwan. And I think there's been hemming and hawing and just kind of general question about, what are even the chances that China is going to invade? Because everyone thinks that invasion is the singular action that China could take, and that's just unrealistic because there's a few reasons. Even hawkish think tanks will admit that China invading Taiwan would come at horrible, terrible cost to China, and it would be a gargantuan effort that would dwarf the D-Day invasions of June 1944, when the United States launched an amphibious invasion against Germany in Normandy, France. So essentially what it would be, you would need to transport maybe 1.2 million Chinese soldiers across the strait, which only has 3 beaches that could host an amphibious landing like that. The strait is very long. You have rocky emplacements where Taiwanese guns are already put into place that could pick off landing ships. You have surface-to-air missile sites all over Taiwan. You have a volunteer. I mean, it is a volunteer. Well, no, they're pressed into service. Sorry, but you have a large military base, like a base of troops to pull from, even if they're not as large as China. So those are all factors that could come into account. But I think the most realistic step that could be taken is a simulated blockade, or a real blockade, the likes of which we've seen simulated after Nancy Pelosi's visit. And I think that's the most likely coercive route that China could take. And if that were to happen, the United States couldn't do anything about it, especially without risking World War III with China, because of course, the Chinese have these hypersonic missiles they've been developing that exceed the range of our aircraft carriers. And I don't believe that the United States has the ability to counter those measures.
I'd happily later maybe get more into the subject of, that was actually one of my later questions, of how realistic is it that China would take Taiwan. But just for now, just to sort of take it back. So who is at fault? Is there any question it isn't the Western allies and the US's fault for these provocations? There's obviously the Pelosi visit, but I'm sure there was many stuff before. Obviously, people talk about how the Trump administration was pretty bad on China. You have obviously all the military bases, in South Korea and Japan, everything there. So could you talk about some of the other US provocations over the years, could be before Trump or the Trump administration?
Yeah, I really think it started in earnest with Obama's pivot to Asia, kind of the next step in this grand strategy chessboard. A lot of them are acolytes of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who, he wrote the grand chessboard talking about ruling the world island and all of these strategic things. A lot of that had to do with Russia. But I think you see the pivot to China as being the United States. Lou Rockwell had a great quote about it that I put in one of my articles, that basically the United States is jealous of China and concerned about its eventual rise. And it's all wrapped up in this pivot, the general opening to China that took place after Nixon, when you have Western investment pouring into that country, and then in the 1990s, you have Deng Xiaoping and his market reforms, I think socialism with Chinese characteristics, or communism with Chinese characteristics, they called it. Deng Xiaoping said to get rich is glorious. and all of a sudden you have all these reforms. I don't know, Louis, if you've ever seen the pictures of Shanghai, the time lapse pictures, where like in a span of 20 years it goes from basically like a farming village to this gargantuan metropolis, like just a real testament to free market reforms and the powers of the market. So I think you have this general sense throughout the early 2000s that, you know, China's all of a sudden exploding, that they're emerging on the world stage, that China is uniquely expansionist in their power. And this was a sentiment actually that was echoed earlier in the 1960s, this fear and hatred of Red China. So you have, you know, Obama in 2011 coming forward with the pivot to Asia. And then under Trump, you really have a redoubling of that policy, because Obama started it, but then Trump really carried it through. And so you have, you know, things, the timeline isn't exactly correct, but in the last few years, you've had arrangements like AUKUS. You've also had the Quad, but all of these first military bases being expanded, reopened in, you know, like in Australia. There's always been deployments there and bases there, but you really have a kind of a redoubling of this, of, you know, B-52 bombers having their permanent facilities in northern Australia, special marine deployments, all of these partnerships with like the Micronesia, the states of Micronesia, the Philippines, and pledges to defend the Philippines. You know, U.S. patrols in the South China Sea, spy planes flying over the Chinese coast, and these military exercises with all of these other nations.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at where some of the most military bases are in the world, it's interesting to see that Germany, South Korea, and Japan are where the most US bases are. And that's because Germany and Japan are still basically occupied since World War II by the US. That's why there's the most military bases, because they still haven't left since World War II. And then obviously South Korea with the Korean War. But you have Japan and South Korea right obviously near China, where there's, you know, the most military bases. Then you have Australia, as you said, the Philippines, where they've, I think Lloyd Austin has made an agreement to open up more military bases in the Philippines. There's, you know, war games and drills that's going to be going on. And if you could just make people familiar with, I'm sure most people have heard of AUKUS, but what is the Quad, and then go on to what AUKUS is, and just give people background, because, you know, they might have heard of it, but they might not know too much about it. So if you just want to start with the Quad, maybe.
Yeah, I actually, this isn't something I've covered extensively, but the Quad is the United States, Australia, India, and Japan. It's not a formal alliance, but they have this interoperability in terms of their forces. And it's actually, it's interesting because India is always this big question mark, because no one really knows exactly where India falls, especially in the like the multipolar new world order, or the the multipolar new world order as a concept, that India kind of has its foot straddling both sides, because I know that India has had military drills, I think with Russia. I'm not exactly sure on that. But you have, I talked about this Stavridis. He was the former Allied commander of NATO, was talking about, he wrote a fiction book about the coming war with China, which I think should alarm everyone. But I actually read it, and I did an episode and I wrote a piece on it. But he identified India as being kind of the wild card of the situation, because in his book he talks about basically the U.S. going to war with China over, you know, some kind of misunderstand, or no, they go to war because China has a sneak attack on a U.S. vessel patrolling in the South China Sea, doing this, you know, area denial operation, and it devolves into a nuclear exchange. And the wild card is India, because India decides to attack whoever launches the next nuke. And so it's like that's how things go. But, you know, there are buildings, or complete cities destroyed in each country in the process. So that's kind of the Quad has been advancing that. But AUKUS, I think, has really emerged, in my opinion, as being more of the premier method for encountering China. It's the Australia, US, and the UK, kind of like an Anglo-American establishment alliance where they're just forming these ties, and the US getting NATO and those Western forces more involved in the fight against China because they're going to have to eventually. And so all of this interoperability, I think, is a main feature of the US plan to contain China. And they always do it too, Louis, in the sense of like, well, we need to protect free trade in the area. We're doing this to maintain freedom and that kind of stuff. But it just doesn't seem like, I mean, the US and China being main trading partners, that the Chinese incentive would be to lock down these areas and prevent, trading vessels from operating there.
Yeah, and Australia, China was their top trading partner, which is interesting why they'd get on that. So maybe we could discuss that later, because it is kind of strange to see. I mean, if I was like even Japan, Australia, any of those countries who've, overtly allied with the US over China, you'd think they'd be watching Ukraine and think, the US does all this talk, it send us the arms, it train us, back us as much as we can. But then, once Russia invaded Ukraine, obviously the US don't have the boots on the ground and they can, arm them to the teeth. But at the end of the day, they're not there. So it's strange they watch that. And it is a similar pattern of, provocative actions, NATO expansion, and then expansion of bases, alliances, and, military war games. And then, they must be watching that and think, that's coming to us. It's in our region. The US is nice and far away. It has its bases in Guam, has Hawaii over there, the Philippines. Are they really getting involved in Ukraine? So, why do you think they're so on board with it? Japan's different because there's historical sort of context of why they hate each other, in India as well. But like Australia, even the US, the UK, like the sudden sort of angering and making them, like Rishi Sunak, the UK Prime Minister, like when he was not quite Prime Minister, but sort of campaigning, he has to put out a long Twitter thread about how China is the top national security threat. And, it's become more of an issue that they're calling China more of a threat than Russia. How much they talk about Russia is kind of hard to see that. So, why do these countries go along with it? I mean, there's probably not a specific reason, because as I said, there's different reasons, but why do you think these countries are so on board with it? Or, is there a split in the region about this agenda and, NATO itself?
There is a split in the region, just in terms of which countries are aligned with the US and which are not. The ones closer to China actually are not quite as on board with this. And I believe it was Cambodia refused, like they have a policy of not letting any foreign military have installations in their country. So it's the ones that are closer that would actually be destroyed in a potential war between the US and China that aren't quite as on board. I think, this is just my opinion and kind of speculation, but I think that it has a lot to do with the fact that these other countries are in some way a vassal state of the US empire, which I think really, as an American, I don't know, I hope that's not presumptuous to say, because I'm completely against that policy. But it might, if you want to get a little conspiratorial, it's the Anglo-American establishment. There's, a lot of vested financial old money interests that are I'm sure behind a lot of this. And there's this whole analysis you can do. You said you had James Corbett on your show, right? I've interviewed him about it. I think it was episode 170. I called it Backdoor to China, because James is really good at seeing a different dimension. And, the whole concept of three-dimensional chess is funny, but he really does see the whole different dimension to this thing, because there's one dimension that is the nation state versus other nation states. But the dimension that you don't necessarily see are the moneyed interests behind both sides of the conflict. When U.S. investment poured into China, there were a lot of U.S. fingerprints on A, the investment, but B, also Chinese politicians themselves. And I know this predates that, but Mao Zedong was Yale educated, is a big thing, and there's a lot of American educated Chinese officials that are out there. And so it's a whole kind of shadier dimension to this whole thing, but I think it could help to explain the muck, at least. But in terms of, why these countries might be going along with it, I mean, it could be that you don't get in power in these countries without playing the U.S. game. And you had mentioned Germany and Japan. They're essentially vassal states of the United States. I mean, their entire security depends on the U.S. That the United States literally wrote the Japanese Constitution, or at least imposed it upon them in a way, this post-war way. You could get into German history and the I forget what the official term for it is, but the U.S. plan that went through and basically created free market opportunity in West Germany post-war. There was this huge miracle of reconstruction because it was led by U.S. Probably U.S. investment, but also free market proposals.
Yeah, no, I mean, if you look at even Russia and China, who's the most hawkish, it is the UK and the US. Like, there's clear splits in NATO with the Russia-Ukraine war and China. And some of this was, I was gonna, ask you later, like the multipolar world, Spain, Germany, some of these countries having meetings with China and saying, we need to work with China. And then you have the US and the UK, the Atlantic powers, if you will, completely obviously on the other side of it. With Russia, it's mainly the UK and the US, and then Poland. But then again, Poland's kind of like a Japan, where it has its own historical reasons for hating that country. But other NATO countries just seem to be, we give a little bit of arms, to show our support to the US, but we're not really that on board with it. We don't really want to, piss off China or Russia that much. And I mean, if you want any evidence of certain countries being vassal states or at least highly influenced by the US, I mean, the Nord Stream bombing would obviously be a pretty clear one. I mean, maybe at the start you wanted to think it was Russia, but I mean, after obviously this many months, it's pretty clear the culprit was most likely the US, one of its allies, on Germany, and they haven't really come out and said too much about it. They've taken it in their stride. They've deprived them of billions of pounds of revenue, during a cost of living crisis, bills, making them already stop buying Russian gas. And, so, there's clear evidence there. I mean, Australia as well, sacrificing their number one trading partner when there's no real national security threat against them. There doesn't really seem to be a clear one against the US. I mean, the US and Australia are almost kind of impossible to occupy because of their size. They're surrounded by ocean, and why would you want to really do that? But so there's a lot sort of to break down there. So do you see a multipolar world breaking out with the rise of China and Russia? Obviously, again, the US policy seems to be pushing these countries further and further together. It's quite strange. And, I think when I spoke to Dave DeCamp, he said, when you sanction all these countries, they end up sort of trading with themselves because the Western countries and, other countries not willing, a bloc starts to form. So is the US not sort of maybe nailing their own demise by pushing countries together who may not have been? Because obviously, as you said, Russia and China never used to be on the friendliest terms. So, and now their alliance is clearly becoming stronger. You have Iran and BRICS. So where do you see that going? Do you think the US can stop it?
At this point, I don't think so. I mean, I know what I would like to see the United States do, which is, like abolish the Federal Reserve and return to the gold standard and get off like this petrodollar system, because I think, it seems like some of the multipolar world, powers are moving to a gold-backed system, or at least I've heard that mentioned. Again, speculating here, but my sense is that the ties between NATO and NATO countries aren't as strong as I think as they would outwardly want the world to believe. And I think that the ball is already rolling in a direction where, the bets have been made, and now it just seems like, if China really can broker a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia, I think that might be a pivotal moment where the United States' influence and power in the world, just at the point of a gun, starts to fall apart openly, because then you would have, China being a more influential, basically making the peace deal of the century. In my opinion, now I don't know what the next century, the next 50 years is going to hold. But it just seems like the power and influence of the United States would just fall apart at that point in time. I have this pet theory where I think about it sometimes, that if there is an Article 5 event where NATO, some countries could declare Article 5 and they would convene the council to determine, what's going to happen. I think people would be surprised to see the countries that are unwilling to respond. And that, in my opinion, would be the end of NATO, because then again, what really is the point? If ultimately the point of having NATO would be to deter, well, it's all bark and no bite if it really comes down to it. So I really do see this coming forward, and it seems like the US action is so blatantly bad at their stated goals, which is undermining Russia and China, that you have to wonder what the real game is. Like, it's the age-old question of, is it stupidity, is it incompetence, or is it malicious behavior? And I know it's not as simple to say it's one or the other. It's probably a mixture of both. But again, what is the ultimate vision? I mean, do you go with Huxley or Orwell? And Orwell would be a multipolar, we've always been at war with East Asia type of situation. And I think it's a mistake. At the very least, I can say this for certain. It is a mistake to believe that the multipolar world order would be any different than the US-led world order at the end of the day. We're still getting all these things we don't like, medical martial law, forced vaccinations. We're still getting the surveillance state, the digital IDs, and the central bank digital currencies. So at the end of I don't think it's right to say that, to embrace the multipolar world order, at least in as much as it would bring about a more peaceful world, perhaps without the overt warfare. But I guess that remains to be seen. I'm not running into the arms of Putin or Xi. So that's just the way it is.
Yeah, just to explain, I don't know how many people may or may not be familiar with it, but when we say multipolar, we're sort of referring to, at the moment, or in the last 20 years, 30 years since the Soviet Union fell, it was a unipolar world, meaning there was only one superpower of the US and its Western allies, which led to the US pretty much feeling like it could do what it wanted in ex-Soviet countries, and in Serbia, Kosovo, Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and so on. And this multipolar world is breaking out, which is, more than one. You have the US not only now against, just Russia or the Soviet Union, of maybe Russia, China, South American countries, Iran, all these, different countries. And you even had Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, wrote an article, I'm not sure if it was just for Der Spiegel, about a multipolar world, which is pretty interesting to see, about him actually writing that himself. We have to see, obviously, where this all leads. And I agree with you. I feel like sometimes people fall into the trap of, they hate NATO and the US so much that means that what Putin and China are doing is good. I mean, you can be against the NATO expansion that led to the influence of the Russian invasion, but you can also be against the Russian invasion. You can also be against China and some of the, the stuff they do in their country. How many people would really maybe want to live there? But I had another question for you, because obviously this new Cold War and the stuff going on in Russia and Ukraine is good for the arms companies. Their share price just keeps on rising, and obviously tensions with China is also good. And you have all the think tanks that are funded by them, also funded by the Taiwan government as well. I'm sure that doesn't influence what they say about China. But are other Western US corporations on board? Because there's so much business between the West and China, and they have their factories there, and the tech companies. It's kind of hard to believe there wouldn't be pushback, because there's the arms corporations and sort of the war lobby in the military, which is obviously powerful. But then the other business lobbies, are they, what's going to happen to them? Do they have plans for like another country to sort of do all their cheap labor? Maybe I'm interested to see if there is going to be any pushback. And right now there doesn't seem to be loads. So what's your opinion on that side of things?
This is the question that Scott Horton keeps asking me. I think he's asked it to me twice when I've been on his show. And I don't see it. And you would think that there would be some kind of a pushback about it. A lot of the debate surrounds around these chips and chip manufacturing, and the CHIPS Act has tried to create U.S. domestic industry. I don't really know, and it would be nice to see that pushback, but at the same time, I think for the American people, what we're really staring down, and maybe we don't realize it, is a drastic decrease in our standard of living if these policies continue to take place and continue to advance. That's one thing that I am certain of. But yeah, I don't really have a good answer for. I haven't seen, you would think Walmart or something like that would be hugely against this policy, because a lot of their goods are manufactured in China and shipped here. So yeah, I don't have a great answer on that.
Well, I guess we'll just have to wait and see, because it is interesting. Because you'd say maybe the arms lobby versus all other big business. You'd think big business would win, but then it's not just the arms lobby, because it's the military, and there's all the hawkish senators and people in the media who have their eyes on China. But it's interesting because, if you look at companies like BlackRock, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Vanguard, Morgan Stanley, they obviously, if you actually look at pretty much every big US company, they're the same shareholders every time. BlackRock, Vanguard has sort of become a bit of a trend now where people realize it. Like, I never knew that, but I'm pretty young in fairness. But, they're the top shareholders of the media. They're the top shareholders of the arms corporations, but then they're top shareholders of the tech companies. So, it would be interesting to see, how BlackRock and sort of those play into this. But anyway, I just wanted to ask you, so, the US provocations are pretty clear. You have all the military bases. You have senators going to Taiwan. You have Nancy Pelosi. You had Britain, the HMS Elizabeth ship, sailing past Russia and China, as, for the rules-based international order, which is their term, which, they don't say like the international law. They normally say the rules-based international law, the Western US backed, which they often say where we went right up to China. It's just clearly obviously provoking them. But is China innocent in this new Cold War? Or have they been restrained over the last years? Have you seen a turn in that they're getting a bit sick of it? Obviously, you referred to the simulated blockade of Taiwan after Nancy Pelosi visited. So, is China innocent in this process, or, have they been fairly innocent until recently when they've been like, okay, we've had enough?
I think that's a great question. It's not a question I remember being asked before. As someone who, I'm an anti-war advocate, but I'm also an American. And I think for me, I don't focus on the actions of China or give a whole lot of light condemning them or criticizing them, because it's not my place to do so, because it is so clear who the aggressor is in this situation. But that being said, also as a libertarian and someone who believes in the smallest government possible, trending towards no government at all as being the final destination, I don't think that China's innocent in this situation. A lot of people, well, I guess some people in the movement have criticized me for being, a Chinese apologist or some kind of Chi-Com or something like that, which is, funny because for myriad reasons. But I don't think that they're innocent here. I think there's a more that they could do in terms of trying to come to a peaceful solution with Taiwan, or just letting them go. I mean, I do believe that the Taiwanese people should have the right to decide which government they want to live under. I mean, ultimately down to the individual. But again, we can't divorce the world from the reality of the situation, which the reality is that governments exist, that the US government exists and China exists. And it's absolutely clear that the US government and Americans should have absolutely no say on, what country, what Taiwan is, or who has sovereignty over Taiwan. It's none of our business and not something that we should be involved with. But furthermore, I mean, China has taken a lot of efforts, and someone cited the anti-secession law at me, saying that basically, well, see, China's evil because they don't rule out the use of force and bringing this, bringing the wayward island back to the mainland. And I think that if you actually read the document, it seems like China's going at lengths to say, we really, really, really want a peaceful solution, and we'll do everything to bring that to be. But, if violence does break out, we'll do everything we can to protect the Taiwanese citizens, but we're gonna, we'll have to take care of it in that situation. And I don't know, if you actually look at it, it just seems imminently reasonable within that, dialectic of good versus evil. But it just seems like the Chinese government, they seem more reasonable if you read their press statements. Of course, I'm not naive, but in the same way, it just, yeah. I mean, it seems like there's a genuine concern to get this solved without resorting to blows.
It's pretty easy to put out a press release about the US government, because there's just a list of stuff in history and to the present day, what you could say about them, about their current illegal occupation of Syria, the fact they sanction, pretty much every government possible they can who's not on their side, their, military use in the Middle East over the last few, this century, everything. But, just how hawkish is it in the US? Obviously, I'm from the UK. We have a few UK listeners here. So just how hawkish are some of these US senators and, some of the statements they make about China?
Oh, it's bad. It's real bad. I mean, specifically, Lindsey Graham and Bob Menendez are two of the, they're the architects of our Ukraine policy and our China policy. But it's not only that. Of course, it's the bipartisan consensus, but I've identified and written about the division of labor here, is that the Democrats have groomed the American people into hating Russia. And that has been the main focus of, Trump and his Russia ties and all of the, Russiagate scandal and that kind of stuff. And that worked so well on half the country that it basically manufactured consent for whatever. And, it really excused, in a way, Trump's hawkish actions towards provoking this Ukraine situation. And of course, that's followed through, and it makes Trump want to act more hawkish, and it also excuses that hawkish behavior. And then whereas, Biden comes in and he's perceived as this weak, stumbling, bumbling old man, and he greatly exacerbates the situation and rejects all diplomacy, it seems like, leading up to the invasion of Ukraine. And then after it, either him or whoever's at the wheel is purposely prolonging the situation and the war with the goal at destroying Russia, basically toppling the government and forcing Putin out of office, which is an incredibly hawkish policy. But you see a frail, feeble old man prosecuting that policy, and everyone thinks that, oh, we're in this problem because he's a frail and feeble old man, right? Likewise, with China, you have these populist Republicans, mainstream Republicans, and populist Republicans, at least holding the same animosity towards China and grooming the American public to fear and hate China. And as a child, I mean, growing up, I've always heard, oh, cheap Chinese crap. You know, the Chinese are stealing our jobs. They're going to take over the world. All they make are these parts that suck, and we should buy American and that kind of stuff. I mean, I don't know if you get that in the UK at all, but it really is something that I've grown up with. And the culture war stuff is just so ingrained in it too. The TikTok stuff and, you know, Chinese fentanyl and all these, the Uyghur genocide and Disney's, and how Disney is like this horrible cultural rot in our society, and they're in bed with the Chinese because they want access to the Chinese market. And the Mulan movie came out, and you saw a Uyghur prison camp in the background, and all these different things that people just kind of accept without really thinking about it. And I would say, yeah, I'm tuned into the situation, being sensitive about it because I work on it, but it really is this animosity towards China, especially from blue collar, more conservative types in the countryside. But you know, then again, all the liberals and the Democrats, the neoliberals, they all hate China, and because they hate Trump, it's attached to that. You know,
it's interesting. Obviously, people always blame external factors, like they don't. Obviously, Big Pharma obviously got a lot of stick before, but I mean, the opioid crisis. So don't try and blame, you know, China or someone about that. Blame, you know, the people who should be accountable to you, or all the corporations that shipped everything to China to get cheap labor and, you know, all the horrible stuff that goes on. You know, you want to hold China accountable, that fine, but you know, Western corporations are obviously part of that too. And just going back to about Lindsey Graham, I mean, I'm obviously not from America, so I don't know all the senators, but Lindsey Graham, you know, comes up time and time again. Like, you know, he literally put out a tweet or said someone should assassinate Putin.
Do you still stand by your call to have Putin be assassinated? Do you still stand by your call?
Yeah, I hope he'll be taken out one way or the other. I don't care how they take him out. I don't care if we send him to The Hague and try him. I just want him to go. Yes, I'm on record. Please understand, Senator Lindsey Graham, and if John McCain were here, he'd be saying the same thing, I think. It's time for him to go. He's a war criminal. I wish somebody had taken Hitler out in the 30s. So yes, that Vladimir Putin is not a legitimate leader. He is a war criminal. He needs to be dealt with by the Russian people.
Like, if anyone did that to the US, I mean, the double standards on the stuff we do is just like incredible. And, you know, you always go back to the argument, like, so if Russia made an alliance with Mexico, or, you know, even like Argentina or something on the bottom of South America, like the US reaction, and top of that with, you know, it's not just the US, it's the whole of NATO. So say you had Russia, China, and Iran, you know, allying with Mexico. What do you think the US would do? Everyone knows the answer, but then you kind of like pretend that Russia doesn't have, you know, the same ideas. You know, you have William Burns, the current CIA director, and I think it was 2008 when the Georgia sort of conflict was going on, and he was, I think, the ambassador to Russia, and he was like, you know, the Russians aren't messing around here. Like, they have clear red lines. They don't want Georgia to join NATO. And then what do? We carry on expanding it. We keep saying Ukraine's going to join. We train them. Trump arms them. And, you know, just keep provoking. And then, you know, if they did anything similar back to us, like the US drone that was just down in the Black Sea, like the backlash after that, like, why is the US drone in the Black Sea? Why is it in the Black Sea? And you could say, oh, you know, because there's NATO allies, Romania, Turkey. Sure, but like, they weren't doing stuff to be with Romania and Turkey. It was obviously to probably get near Crimea, Russia, Ukraine to provide intelligence. So, if it's down in the Black Sea, that's not anywhere near the US. But I just wanted to ask you again, what is the obsession specifically with Taiwan? Is it just a vehicle or means to provoke China? Because we have military bases surrounding them already. Do we really need one in Taiwan? Or is it just, to keep provoking them to, or is there actual more strategic use of it? Because, again, we have military bases all around them. Like, why did I'm not talking about the people here, like the US empire, the national security state. Why are they obsessed with Taiwan? Or is it just, sort of remnants of the Cold War?
I think that in my study and my writings and trying to learn and educate myself about this, because I'm not an expert at this, I would love to be. I would love to do this full time and really get down to it, but I just can't. But there are so many parallels between Taiwan, Ukraine, and Kosovo and Serbia. And, there's so many other ones where what I think the value of it is that this is the US getting involved in a civil war, essentially, is that this is territory that is part of the sovereign nation or the idea of it, right? Where you have in the Donbass, you have you could even say about the entire Middle East is that these nations were formed after World War I, just drawing lines on a map, right? There's no consideration for ethnic ties. You tried to have a secular government that rules over a very diverse group of people who have their own history and societies and consider themselves to be part of an ethnic civilization, if you will. I mean, like the Kurds, they rightfully maybe should be their own nation and have their own territory, but they don't consider themselves, at least I don't think, they don't think of themselves as being Iraqis first. They think of themselves as being Kurds, right? So in Kosovo, you have a situation where you have the former Yugoslavia and you have it breaking up, but you also have this question of, well, the Serb homeland is in Kosovo. I mean, that's just the way it has been. And now we're going to intervene in a civil war on behalf of one side and completely demonize that one side or the other side. And in Ukraine, you have the people of the Donbass who are Russian speaking, who should rightfully be part of Russia, except for an accidental drawing of a map after, because of various geopolitical consequences. But the utility to the U.S., thinking from completely strategic point of view, is to get involved in that internal, because what you do is you cause tumult amongst the population, and I think it fractures or at least shakes the foundation of the regime. And in doing so in Russia, you see what is the ultimate goal? Well, it's to get Putin out of power. How do we do that? Well, we intervene in this internal conflict. It's like regime change 101, it seems like. At least, it's maybe they prefer regime change to actual conflict. I don't know if that's true, but it seems like the best way to conquer a country would be a bloodless coup. Change the leadership and change that country's alignment without firing a shot, maybe. And with Taiwan and China, it's the same thing. It's an internal dispute that strikes to the very heart of the legitimacy of the PRC, because it's so historically tied up in that. I mean, the Taiwanese government used to be the ROC until pretty recently. I mean, within the last 30 years. So I think that's what it is.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Civil wars that go on, get a foothold in there, back the side that's going to, back you basically after, and just cause conflict, just drain over years, just resources going on Russia, on China, Serbia, like you said, the Kurds. We backed the Kurds in the 70s and the 60s before we sort of team up with Saddam Hussein against Iran, a lot, just, stirring up trouble to destabilize the regime. And then again, now in Syria, the US occupies the northeast along with the Kurds. So, we use people who want to break away, whether that, they speak for the whole population or not, like in Taiwan, but just enough, to convince at least people in, the Western world that, we're doing something good. It's pretty clear, whatever you think, is Taiwan part of China? Is it not? At the end of the day, we shouldn't be having anything to do with this. We shouldn't be meddling in elections. There's constant press releases about, like Venezuela. We say he is not the president. The UK doesn't recognize the Venezuelan president. So the Bank of England freezes 1.2 billion gold we're holding from them just because the government says he's not the president. We should, back out of it. And you've got to ask yourself, why Taiwan? Like whether, or Ukraine, like whether you think they should generally defend themselves. I'm not here to argue against that, but I'm saying, why are you so focused on them and not some other country where horrible stuff's going on in the world all the time? But it's the fact you're focused on this country, that you care about this country, you should question it. But you've given me over an hour here, so I'll start finishing up. Just a couple more questions, one more question, then you can give your final thoughts and just tell people where to find you. Is China any threat to US or Western national security? Like, is there any evidence they've shown after the years? And I don't mean China's economy rising above the US against the US empire. I mean the people of those countries who, are part of this geopolitical game. Is China any threat to the people of the US or Western nations?
No, I mean, I don't believe so. I don't think that Americans should be spending any time or energy worrying about Red China or anything like that. Maybe China doesn't want basketball players speaking ill of the Chinese Communist Party, or else they won't be able to sell their products in China. Like, I don't really see. I mean, maybe the best argument for that, because there is no argument that China is going to roll up on the beaches of California. Maybe the best argument for that is that China would be influencing U.S. culture to be more totalitarian, or the argument really is that China is weaponizing TikTok to make our children pansies or something, or some kind of, introducing this, mind virus of progressivism. And I'm being hyperbolic to kind of emulate what the right wingers here are saying. Maybe that's the most, plausible argument here. But again, that it's a conspiracy theory, really. I mean, the idea that the Chinese Communist Party thinks the most effective way to defeat the United States and unseat them in the global unipolar world order is by using a social media app to make their children gay and trans. Like, it just seems outlandish and ridiculous from the start. Or to, use fentanyl to kill all of the burnouts from our society, and that's going to destabilize us or something. I don't think so. But China is a threat to our global dominance.
Yeah, I mean, again, anything you accuse China of doing to us, we're doing to them. Those military bases around them, they're not innocent. They obviously use them to collect intelligence. Stuff like Five Eyes still exists from the Cold War, even though the Soviet Union fell, NATO too. And you're like, oh, China's going to use these security cameras to do this because they're made by China, or TikTok. Well, if they can do it, then our own government can do it. The national security state, there's just a handful of evidence of how they cooperate with tech companies covertly. And I mean, these companies overtly have literal relationships with defense companies. They work with the military. They have some of their foundations from, Incutel and the CIA. The internet came from ARPA, which is now DARPA, like the technology wing of the military, called the ARPANET, which became the internet. You have the Edward Snowden. So, whatever China's doing to us, our own government could obviously be doing the same thing. But I think the best option is obviously to try and stay out of this as much as we can. And I asked you that question recently. An ex-Australian Prime Minister, I can't remember if it was Paul Keating or something. He is asked on the the news in Australia, like, is China going to invade? He's like, no, that's like stupid.
Yeah.
Like, obviously they're not. And he said it's all about the US and making us doing it because, you know, the US empire is going to be potentially eclipsed by China. It has nothing to do with the national security in the sense of the people. And again, you know, geographically, I think he talked about too how big the US is and Australia. We're not going to be.
Is either threatened us or will threaten us. Now, this is a distortion and it's untrue. China does not threaten the United States. Nobody can threaten the United States. It's got 10,000 kilometres of sea between the Chinese coast and California. It's got the Atlantic Ocean on the other side. It has a massive country with in space, in land mass and friends in Canada on the north and Mexico on the south, and the greatest armaments in all history. China has committed, in the eyes of the United States, the great sin of internationalism. And what is that sin? To develop an economy as big as the United States. That's the sin. They've got as big as the US. The Americans will never condone or accept a state as large as them, you know, and that's what China presents. China's mere presence. I mean, they would have preferred they remain in poverty, 20% of humanity forever. But the fact that China is now, you know, an industrial economy larger than the United States, larger, according to the IMF, 20% larger, they say, hang on, this is not in the playbook. This is not in the playbook. You know, what an affront. This is about the maintenance of US strategic hegemony in Asia. Now, this is a country which has no land in the metropolitan zone of Asia. There's no US in Asia. It's 10,000 kilometres across the Pacific to the coast of California. So they are not a metropolitan Asian power, but they claim to be and wish to be the primary strategic power in Asia. So what are the Chinese supposed to say to that? Oh, that's okay. We've been here 4,000 years. We've developed, you know, we've been subjugated by every bugger known to man. We've developed a decent economy, a decent standard of living, you know, shelter, accommodation, education, you know. That's our sin, is it? That's our sin. And we've got to be superintended by your Navy, you know, by the US Navy. Could you just imagine if the Chinese Blue Water Navy decided to do their sightseeing 6 miles off the coast of California? Could you imagine the brouhaha that would go on?
But anyway, just, yeah, any closing comments about China specifically in the US or anything you felt we've missed? If not, you can just tell people where to find you.
Yeah, a couple comments. I think the first one is just how ridiculous and misguided this whole Red Scare of China is. I think it detracts from legitimate actions that China probably is taking because it's just so over the top. But it's also just stupid because if you watch the hearings with the TikTok CEO went in front of Congress, and I don't remember exactly who asked him this. I don't know if it was, I don't know who it was, but someone said, what do you condemn the Uyghur genocide? And something about how being a Chinese citizen and the Chinese government would prevent him from doing that. And he's like, well, I'm Singaporean, so I really don't, you know, and furthermore, anyone can discuss whatever they want on the platform. We don't prevent people from talking about the alleged Uyghur genocide or anything like that. Yeah, and the other thing too, there's kind of a flip side too, and in a way I would say I'm a realist when it comes to foreign policy. And I know realism is a whole different notion, but what I'm referring to is I try to see things for what they actually are and not for what other people say they are, or what the whole realism is not the right term because realism actually is a school of foreign policy. I'm not referring to that. I'm just saying that I try to evaluate the Chinese threat for what it objectively is, if that exists, an objective understanding, because you have other people kind of in our spheres. The flip side of it is they try to minimize the Chinese threat so much that it seems like it turns into another wing of the imperial propaganda, where they say, oh, well, you know, China's undergoing this incredible demographic crisis and the entire economy is a huge Ponzi scheme bubble and the country's going to implode and be destroyed in the next 5 or 10 years. And, you know, the population's going to decrease and all this kind of stuff. And, you know, while there might be some truth to that, I just want to temper that because I don't see China going anywhere on the world stage. I don't think that they are a threat, but I also don't think that they're going to collapse like a dying star either. I think that they'll continue to have influence in their near abroad, that their position on the world stage will be growing because they have investments that they, you know, are making an inroads with other countries and creating this alternative system. But I don't see China ever being a true world power in the sense that the United States was. I think that's just fanciful thinking. And basically it's fear, essentially fear of the other. And yeah, that's just kind of my thought about it, trying to see it for what it actually is without spin either way. So you can find my work at vitaldissent.com, libertarianinstitute.org. When I publish my articles, which are hard to put out because they're always so long and detailed, and I try to explain the background for everything for people who don't know anything about it. But when they do appear, they're usually run on antiwar.com. So check that out there. But I appreciate you inviting me on the show and letting me just talk a whole lot.
No, you didn't talk too much. Obviously, now you gotta let the point breathe and explain all the scenarios. You know, if I jump in and every bit, it just takes too long. Obviously, there's some bits we need to address. Just a couple of things I actually missed. I'm not going to make you answer it, but also, obviously, China recently mediated the role between Saudi Arabia and Iran bringing peace, which shows, again, China is maybe growing in the Gulf states and that sort of region, surpassing US supremacy. So there's obviously clear evidence of China becoming more powerful on the international stage. Whether that, you know, that doesn't mean they're going to invade us, but, you know, it means, you know, it is a reality that their economy is growing, that their power on the world stage, and there is these alliances expanding. And just the other one that we obviously didn't discuss was, you know, the FBI and the ex-CIA directors like Mike Pompeo coming out and saying, you know, clearly that COVID was a lab leak from China. And again, wherever you think about COVID, where it came from, you know, these people have an agenda of saying that, and the fact they said it now and not during it. And, you know, it's also kind of interesting that China was, you know, the first country to have COVID spread, and, you know, all the Western nations and US went along with everything they did when, you know, they're meant to be the enemy. So there's some interesting stuff there, but I appreciate your time and coming on. I recommend people to check out some of your work, some of your interviews, and the recent one you did about Taiwan being part of China. If not, just read the documents. They're not that long. You know, it might not be the most interesting, but they are fairly short. But yeah, thank you for coming on.
Yeah, appreciate it.